WPHT, WPHT HD, WOGL HD3 Philadelphia. A radio.com station. Now, live from the Malamut and Associates Law Studios. This is Jeff Bolton.
Hey, it's Jeff with you here on 1210 WPHT, day after D-Day. Of course, that speech, as you just heard from our president, remarkable and beautiful. And for all of the grief that he is given, man, oh man, oh man, to see get that right. And his speech there was fantastic. And look, we've got, besides D-Day, the Russians at least threatened to ram one of our ships in international waters. Sheer jackassery. Shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody, but nevertheless, there it is. We've got that to get to, and of course, the trade issue with China. So I wanted to get my good friend, Colonel John Antal, to join us on the program, because all of these things fall into his bucket of many areas of expertise. His website is American-leadership.com. You got to throw the dash in there. He's written 7 books on leadership. He coaches, he mentors. He in the Army, had a remarkable career in the Army. And served in a tremendous number of positions. And for our conversation today, sir, you just got back from D-Day recently, and what an incredible trip. Because of some things I have going on that you're aware, I couldn't join you on this trip, but man, I sure wanted to. How was it?
Oh, Jeff, it was fantastic. First, thank you very much for having me on your show today. And yes, I was just in Normandy with a great group of Americans. A lot of them successful businessmen and a vice mayor of a major town in Texas, and other folks who wanted to come out and learn leadership from the lessons learned of D-Day, and that's what we do. So we had this wonderful trip. We were there for 7 days, and we walked where they fought. We had a chance to learn from their decisions and learn from their challenges. And everything we do is totally different than any other trip that people go on. We are immersive, interactive, and memorable, so you actually have to participate. So when we went to St. Miraglise, we drove to a place not far away called Lafayette, and there's a bridge there that was crucial in the fighting on D-Day and the days after D-Day. And this bridge became a choke point to stop the Germans from counterattacking, and then became an important area for us to break out from. And every one of the members who were on our trip had to fight that battle, either as red or blue, and learn what it's like to actually plan, prep, and execute a fight. And then they had to argue their case, like a Harvard case study, against each other, against how they were going to attack or defend. It was just really an amazing experience, because it puts you in the boots of the paratroopers, puts you in the boots of the people who live there, and gives you just a small idea of what it's like to actually have been there on D-Day. So it was a wonderful trip. And next time you're going to have to join us.
I'm going to, and you were kind enough to invite me, and I fully intend to take you up on that, because it is, as I have said, a bucket list for me to go to those beaches. And while you guys were over there, sir, I was reading Ernie Pyle. As you know, I'm a big fan of Ernie Pyle, and I was reading a number of his columns, and man, they make me weepy every time I read them. They are just so well done, and make me more than ever want to go.
Most people may not know that Ernie Pyle was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who went with the soldiers in World War II and reported from their perspective. So this wasn't the kind of guy like we have now, who in Iraq, is in the green zone the whole time and only comes out from the cocktail bar to make a quick report. This guy lived with the soldiers in the trenches.
You know my how exercised I get over that.
I know.
You're absolutely right.
And you're very much like Ernie Pyle in many ways, Jeff, because you went to Iraq, you did all that stuff, and you were with the troops. So that makes a huge difference.
You got to put in my case, you got to put your mic in the fight. And,
that's right.
And get out as far as as you possibly can. I'm continuing to do that in my career, and I will always continue to tell the story of the United States military member. As we're on D-Day, sir, we've got a lot to talk about. We've got Russia and China on the agenda today, but to stay in this theme of D-Day, we just played for the audience President Trump's speech at about 22, 23 minutes, it seems like it was.
Yeah.
And he gets, of course, a massive amount of grief for a variety of reasons. But I look at his State of the Union addresses, and I look at his speech from Normandy. He got it right in tone, in content. It's a very moving speech and very well done.
Yeah, precisely right. I mean, pride of our nation, glory of our republic. I mean, that sums it up right there. That's what he said. And when you think about that, the pride of our nation, this was the best we had when we sent them forward to try to liberate people they'd never met who were under the oppression of Nazi occupation for 4 years. France was conquered in 1940, and the Germans were there until we kicked them out in August 44, around, in some places even a little bit later, but basically 4 whole years of occupation where they were treated as slaves, where their vote didn't matter, where the men were anywhere from 14 to 65 were taken out to be used for the construction of German military camps and German military preparations. In fact, most of the Atlantic Wall, all the defenses along the Normandy coast, were created with slave labor, and a lot of those were just Frenchmen of those ages, from 14 to 65, who were pressed into work gangs and lived on minimal rations, working constantly to create the obstacles and bunkers and other things. So when we came across the pride of our nation, the glory of our republic, this is a really amazing statement because it's about those men and women who fought there, and it's about the sacrifice that they, in fact, delivered, because when we asked them, they didn't hesitate. When the war started, they volunteered, and they knew the price. And when we asked them, their leadership, their courage, it was there. It was amazing. And they freed a continent. We could have bombed that continent into oblivion and not invaded and just kept bombing them. But that would have just devastated everything, and it never would have brought a decision about. So we had to break into Hitler's Atlantic Wall. We had to attack. But the idea that President Trump says the pride of our nation and the glory of our republic, then when he talks about in the glory of our republic, it's about the United States of America as a free democratic republic where we believe in the concept of limited government, where we believe in the idea that you are represented by representatives who are supposed to, listen to you and to let your voice be heard. This is the kind of thing that resonates across the world in many places. And right now in Europe, it's interesting because the European Union, in many places, the people there, and I was just in Europe, not only just for their Normandy trip, but also I was in Italy and some other places. I was in Spain. And you talk to some of the folks there, and they feel like they live under a bureaucracy that doesn't listen to them. So the long-term problems for the European Union is how do they get participatory government? How do they get people involved in the government? And many of the elite don't want people involved in the government. They just want them to obey, which is why Brexit occurred. So you see what Trump was doing was he was very, very, very carefully saying several things. One, that courage is so important, and your people have to believe in what they stand for and what they'll fight for and what they'll die for, because that gives you a nation. And then that nation, if it is a free republic, it has the opportunity and it has the great possibility, to allow people to live in the freest form of government possible. Now, it's not perfect, like no government is perfect. Nothing built by man is perfect. But if you have a choice of living under Chinese dictatorship or Russian dictatorship, and then you have a chance of living in the United States of America, where would you choose? And I say, well, some people say, well, if I'm a Russian, I choose Russia. If I'm Chinese, I choose China. If that were the case, let's just look at the amount of immigrants who are trying to break into China and become Chinese citizens, and the number of people who are trying to break into Russia to become Russian citizens.
That is not a thing.
Right.
That is not a thing.
Right.
Great point. In fact, listen, we're going to talk about that. We'll take a quick break here. I want to remind all of you that are listening right now, too, in the break even, jump over to Colonel Antal's website, American-leadership.com. Just put a dash between those two words, American-leadership.com. You can see his newest book there, Leadership Lessons of D-Day. As well. And we'll continue our conversation with him next and talk about very specifically the Russians and the Chinese right here on 1210 WPHT. Jeff Bolton with you here on 1210 WPHT. Glad you've joined us this afternoon. Here is the modern world that we live in. We have nation states, of course, that are rising in a way that they have not in a lot of in many years. We've been playing whack-a-mole with terrorists around the world in the last 20 years, 25 years even, and inside that time frame. Russia, with some petrodollars, is attempting to rebuild its military and flex its muscles. China, replete with plenty of money that's come from the United States from us buying cheap Chinese crap, is attempting to become a world power, militarily speaking. And they are both flexing their muscles in the Pacific and in Asia. The Chinese want us out. They do not believe that the United States should be in charge of global commerce. And they want us out of the Pacific, and they're doing some aggressive things to try to bump us out of there. The Russians now, in some partnership with the in partnership with the Chinese, are again seeking more sources of revenue and relationship. So it's making for a very, very different dynamic than we have experienced in a long time. For those of you that are maybe just joining us, my friend Colonel John Antal is with us. He's a highly experienced, now retired military officer, teaches leadership, and is a deep reader. And it's one of the things that we share in common that I like a lot. Sir, let's start with this week, the dangerous navigation of a Russian destroyer near a United States destroyer. Where our folks were forced to all ahead back with both engines to avoid a collision with the Russians who came barreling at us basically and turned away. This is sort of typical Putin riding a tiger shirtless show-off sort of nonsense that we see from them, but it continues to get more dangerous, it seems like, each time they do it.
Yes, it does. The USS Chancellorsville was nearly rammed by a Russian ship. And if anyone has an opportunity to go on the internet and just look at the pictures of this, what's interesting is you can see the wake of the Russian ship, because what happens is in the water when an aerial photo is taken, the wake of a ship, the trail of a ship actually shows for a long time, and you can see the Russians took this very dramatic turn toward our ship and came right alongside of it and could have rammed it. So we've had this kind of thing happen before. They've had aircraft that buzz our ships and try to be provocative. And this one was particularly timed because President Xi of China was in Moscow at that moment with Putin, and they were talking about a grander alliance against the United States, and several trade deals were made between China and Putin. Basically, Putin agreed to accept Huawei as the 5G provider, which the Russians must understand is a double-edged sword, because Huawei is a state-owned Chinese internet mobile phone provider, and they will. The leader of Huawei is also a retired PLA, the Army of China, the Chinese Army officer, and they will get all the information from Russia on this 5G superhighway that they're going to build for the Russians, and every piece of information that goes across that network could be subject to Chinese capture. So it's an interesting thing that Putin has done here. The Chinese, of course, with the Huawei business, they offer free infrastructure, which is very lucrative for most countries because that's
right.
a difficult thing. So with the sweetness, you get the sour, and that's the problem with the Chinese. So when you talk about this ship, it's an amazing thing to have happen because it happened in the East China Sea. And it didn't happen in the waters outside of Russia, anywhere near Russia.
Right.
So Putin was demonstrating to Z, his buddy, who said, by the way, that Z said that Putin was his best friend, that he could, in fact, bully the United States in the East China Sea, something that's near and dear to the Chinese, because they are, in the South China Sea, they are putting together a military complex where they're building islands and reclaiming these shallow waterways that with thousands of tons of dirt and rock, they're building islands so that they can create unsinkable aircraft carriers and missile platforms, because they only have a military purpose, and that's the only thing, so they can control the South China Sea. So it's a very interesting thing to watch on how these two powers, rising China and declining Russia, the former Soviet Union, are working together to oppose the United States.
Sir, when you start looking at the dynamic between Z and Putin, you can certainly make a case to your point that one person's going to control that relationship and the other one kind of just has their hat in their hand. What are the implications for us as a nation if that relationship between the Russians and Chinese grows as much as is being predicted?
Well, it's something to be concerned about, because we've always worried that if the Chinese and the Russians were totally linked arm in arm against us, that makes their power greater, and we have definitely to be concerned about that. Now, what we have to do is we have to be very adept at managing this situation. And, the Chinese and the Russians both are very angry at the United States because they feel humiliated by the U.S. The Russians feel humiliated, particularly Putin, because of the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, mostly it was their problem, but we were their opposition. So they feel that their greatness was taken away by the United States. And the Chinese feel that the West, now represented as the leader of the West, the United States, humiliated them over the last 200 years. You can build a case that shows the Chinese, of course, were what we called the sick man of Asia in 1900, and how their country was broken up into warlordism and then finally into a huge civil war, then completely ravaged by the Japanese. The Japanese controlled almost 60% of China during World War II and killed millions of people. The Japanese killed at a greater rate and a greater volume than the Nazis ever did. So when you start looking at the death toll of World War II, and some people say it's 50 million, some people say it's 60 million, no one really knows, because the number of Chinese was never really well counted. There was never a very good census. So the number of Chinese and Russians that died in World War II was tremendous. So now we have the Chinese and the Russians sort of working together. And of course, their problem is that they're both strict totalitarian regimes. The Chinese communists and the Russian totalitarians, that Putin controls everything. They have what I like to call is a very hierarchical, very brittle system. We have a bit of a self-adjusting system because we have a relatively free economy and a relatively free ability in the government to transition and work under our democratic republic to change things. We self-adjust over time, and it doesn't take a huge revolution, an assassination, or a coup d'etat to be able to change things in our government, and we're able to do so over the long time based on merit. So our capitalist society succeeds based on it, whether it's good or bad. It's not the same in China. It's not the same in Russia. In Russia and China, it depends a lot on who you know and how connected you are to the Communist Party or to the oligarchy of the leaders in Russia. Now, some people might say, well, it's always important to who you know, even in the United States. But it truly is different here. In the United States, you can actually have a company that starts in a garage and turns into a huge player on the market. We know that all the time with both Apple and Microsoft and other companies. We have entrepreneurism here where people can make the world better, and they could actually rise to the level of their merit. And that's a huge draw. Again, why people are coming to America versus coming to Russia and China.
Sure.
So the Russians and the Chinese have these huge problems, and because they're not a self-adjusting system, because they're very brittle, because they, in fact, have to control everything, they have great waste. So I think you're well aware that in China, there's hundreds of cities that they have created that they've spent billions of dollars on that are totally unoccupied. And you say, how can that happen? Well, it's happened. It doesn't take, you can go on the internet and you can see it. Abandoned Chinese cities. And the reason they've done this is because to keep going, they have to expand. To keep progressing, they have to build. And that's why they own 50 ports across the world. They've created deals with people like Djibouti and other places in Africa and in surrounding India, where they make a deal with the country and say, we'll build you a brand new port and you owe us, this many billions of dollars. And then that country can't pay it. So they say, well, here's what we'll do. You just give us the port and we'll be okay. So now the Chinese own the ports. They own 50 ports outside of China. So there's a lot of things that the Chinese are doing to try to expand that may eventually hurt them in the end. So we have to take a long view here, try to avoid confrontation, try to work this out, because a world war is in no one's benefit. A war in general is in no one's benefit.
Sure.
So we want to do the best we can to preserve the peace. But, of course, what happens is the United States right now is the world superpower that is considered the only nation where the rule of law can actually be trusted. And although it's not always perfect, it certainly is much better than any law in China, which is arbitrary, and any law in Russia, which is arbitrary. So if you're going to do business, you do business with the United States, and that's why we are the reserve currency of the world. And the reserve currency means that the dollar becomes the medium of trade. So oil is purchased through dollars and everything else. The Chinese and the Russians want to change that.
Right.
But not too many other countries want to take the Chinese dollar versus the U.S. dollar, because they know the Chinese manipulate their currencies in different ways.
So here's what I want to do. Quick break here, and I want to continue this discussion because this cabal of Russia and China is going to dictate so much of what's going to happen over the next number of years. So we'll do that. We'll continue that discussion with my friend Colonel John Antal with us here on the program. Remember, go to his website, American-leadership.com. And just you'll start to get a window into his brain, which is always of huge value to us on the air. So we'll continue that conversation with him next, right here on 1210 WPHT. Jeff Bolton with you here on 1210 WPHT. Listen, when you start looking at what's happening with the Russians and the Chinese, they represent obviously the nation state threat to us. Again, I said it earlier, we've spent 25 years playing whack-a-mole with terrorists, and we have not been as attentive to Asia. I think to me, and sir, I'd like you to expand on this. My friend Colonel John Antal with us, U.S. Army officer, tanker, tons of different high-level jobs, now teaches leadership for a living. Our capacity to manage both of those groups is extremely important. You made I thought a great point. I tell people this all the time, and they look at me funny. There's no win in us going to war with either one of them. It just makes no sense. That said, I think Putin thinks that he could employ a tactical nuclear weapon today and get away with it. We have given him enough confidence to think that he could do that somewhere in the Baltics or wherever. If he does it, if he decides he wants Latvia and employs a single tactical nuke, what are we going to do about it? It's just hard for me to see that we've got the right response to that, at least militarily. I'm wanting you to jump in and guide us through this conversation.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Jeff, for I think the average listener to say, okay, why are we talking about Russia and China? All I've heard on the news so far has been about internal discord in the United States. But there's a whole world out there that's happening. And while we've been very distracted with not only our wars in the Middle East, but also our internal politics, the Chinese have been on the march and the Russians have been trying to rearm. What's interesting is this Putin has rearmed almost as effectively as as Adolf Hitler rearmed Germany from 1930 to 1939. Because in 1930, Germany had almost nothing. They had no panzer divisions, no tank divisions. By 1939, they were ready to launch a war against Poland, and they were much better shape. Putin has done the same thing, and I've studied in depth his arms industry and what he's doing, and they have some brilliant weapons, which are very scary. And luckily, they don't have enough money to mass produce many of them, but they're making enough to where their point of the spear is very hard and very new and very updated. And so they can do some interesting things, like they can move into Crimea, as they did a few years ago, and occupy the entire country without firing a shot, and get the Western world to say, oh, okay, I guess we're not going to do anything, which is pretty interesting because it was a free country. Now, Ukraine, of course, Crimea was part of Ukraine, and we don't have a treaty with Ukraine that would cause us to get involved in a fight there. But we do have a treaty with Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Most Americans probably don't know this, but Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are all in the Baltic, the northern part of that tier above Belarusia and near Poland, all of that area there is part of NATO. And by NATO treaty, we are committed to defend them if they are invaded by Russia. And, of course, Russia says many of these people speak Russian. They really belong to Russia, and we really should reoccupy them as we did in the days of the Soviet Union. So those are some interesting flashpoints that we have to manage very carefully because, as you said, no one wins if we go to war. And we want to keep the peace, but we also have to know that keeping the peace doesn't mean surrendering everything. So in the last few years, we had a lot of concepts where we would say, well, if we just give in to them, if we appease them, if we pay the Iranians for perhaps millions of dollars in an airplane in cash in the middle of the night that we land in their airfields, and we give them this, they'll just be nice. The problem with that is when you appease these dictators, these totalitarian dictatorships, oftentimes you just fuel their egos and you fuel their capability to have mischief. And that's what happened with the Iranians. So we reverse course on that. And that's pretty much what's happened with the Chinese and the Russians. So we're reversing course on that, but we're being very careful about it because we're trying not to get kinetic. We're trying not to cause a fight. For instance, when the Chancellorsville, the USS Chancellorsville, the ship that was in the East China Sea, was almost rammed by the the Russian ship the other day. We could have, by law, fired on that ship.
Right.
Imagine if we had. I mean, we would be in a shooting war. And, of course, that's what they were tempting us to do. And they knew we wouldn't. And, of course, we did not. And one of the interesting things is that most Americans don't think about China and Russia much in this case, but you're going to hear much more about it in the news. And the issue is truly this, is that if the enemy thinks it's at war but you do not, that's the greatest form of deception. A great Chinese military theorist, guy named Sun Tzu, some people say Sun Tzu, his philosophy was that all warfare is based on deception. And the greatest deception is to be at war and your opponent not even know it. And, of course, we see this every day in the domain of cyber warfare.
Sure.
And so what happens is that we are attacked consistently by Russia and China. And anyone who wants to look, just go on the internet and put down list of Chinese attacks against U.S. and U.S. companies in the last 10 years, and the list is amazing. And the same thing with Russia. Now, the Russians primarily do this to gain money. The Chinese primarily do this to steal information, and it's basically corporate and national espionage. But they do some of it to do money. And the North Koreans, who are the Chinese puppets, believe me, North Korea doesn't do anything unless their Chinese masters let them do it. The North Koreans do this primarily for money. They do it to try to get ransomware and all the other things because they're broke. So when you look at this cyber war that's going on, we haven't even admitted until recently that we're actually in a war with other nations. And we're at war right now in the cyber domain with China. And that is something that could be a real problem because if we do not respond, and we have not responded very much in the cyber arena offensively, if we don't do some offensive operations in cyber, then you'll never have a deterrent. Deterrence is the ability to say, hey, if you hurt me, I'll hurt you. But if you say, you can hurt me and I won't respond, you can punch me and I won't punch back. Well, if you have a bully, he'll just keep punching you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's our challenge.
It is an enormous challenge. Those of you that are just joining us, Colonel John Antal is with us. He is a U.S. Army veteran, a tanker, served high level staff jobs, is teaching leadership for a living now. And as we look at the issue I guess against the backdrop of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, one of the things that we see is that the nation, China certainly and Russia, are both extremely hostile to the United States. Colonel Antal used the word humiliated. They felt humiliated. The aftermath of the death of the Cold War, with Russian subs, nuclear subs sitting, shoved on up onto the beach like discarded toys. We had to go in and clean up that mess. We have, we've been in some ways, I guess, the policemen of the world, if you will, for a lot of years. And sir, it's difficult it's difficult to underestimate exactly the level of hatred that they have for us.
Right. Humiliation is a powerful emotion. And the Russians, particularly Putin, because don't forget he's a prior KGB agent. So he saw his entire world destroyed without a shot being fired and with everyone just collapsing. And so the thought of the real defeat was never truly driven home. It was more like we were stabbed in the back. This is the same sort of feeling that the Germans had after World War I. For those of you that are historians, you well know that the Germans initially after World War I, had democracy, and they tried to vote in representatives who would actually represent the people and have a new form of government after they'd had a Kaiser, which was total dictatorship basically. And although it was a benevolent dictatorship, it was nonetheless dictatorship. But they tried to do this, their economy crashed, and they felt that they had been stabbed in the back by not only the Western powers, but by the communists and other people. And they blamed the Jews, and they blamed everyone else but themselves. And this is what brought the rise of Adolf Hitler, and this is what fueled the ability of Nazi Germany to almost conquer, all of Europe. And who knows, if they'd been able to develop nuclear weapons, what they would have been able to do. So this humiliation is a huge human emotion. And there's very little ways that we can deal with their feelings of humiliation. But we have to be careful because, we could force a war here by not recognizing that and not being able to adeptly handle this situation. And we don't want China or Russia as our enemies. But right now it's impossible, truly, for President Trump to bring Russia to our side because of the internal squabbles we have in the United States. So there's a huge problem there. And his opposition to unfair trade practices with China is crucial in being able to redress the balance right now. And if we don't do this, if we just give in to the Chinese and say, okay, well, we'll just continue to have a very bad trade deficit with you, a very bad trade deal, continuing to give you great profits and us take great losses, well, that becomes not self-sustaining. It becomes something that we lose at tremendously, and they gain at tremendously.
Right.
I mean, most people don't realize that the profit that the Chinese are making off of the U.S. relationship has been able to fuel their entire military development. Their entire military is paid for just by that profit.
It's a remarkable thing. Here's what we'll do. One last break here, and we'll come back, continue this conversation about the future of this relationship and militarily what we can and should be doing about it. We'll do that here with Colonel John Antal next on 1210 WPHT. Jeff Bolton with you here on 1210 WPHT. Beautiful afternoon in Philly, 80 and sunny. We're talking with Colonel John Antal. His website, American-leadership.com. You can grab his books there. I highly recommend to you that you do that. I am a reader of those books, and each time he takes a different piece of leadership around a major historical event, in this case D-Day, 7 leadership lessons of D-Day, and does a spectacular job with that. And in his years of both being a combat guy and a staff guy, planner, et cetera, we get the benefit of his wisdom when we're looking at some of these very, very deep and heavy geopolitical issues. In this case, as we talk about, sir, what we need to do, what we should be doing with regard to the Chinese and the Russians. Militarily, we have to walk a fine line. We know that war doesn't help us. So I'm gonna give you a hard one. It's been discussed at length that the Chinese are sick and tired of our involvement with Taiwan, and that there's going to come a day sooner than later where they decide to put an end to it and to take Taiwan back directly under their fold. As I said with Putin, if he decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon because he wants Latvia, how are we going to handle that? What if anything can we do in your mind?
Well, one of the things that we must do is we must study the situation and understand how we were able to win the Cold War. We were up against much fiercer odds in the Cold War than we are today. The challenge today, however, is different, and the technology is different. So we have to seriously study how we can create a deterrent to bad action. Now, the deterrent for Putin to launch a nuclear attack on a NATO ally is, in fact, that the NATO treaty says we will respond in kind. So that would be something that has to clearly be articulated to Putin so that he understands. Now, the problem there is we're triggering nuclear war over Latvia or Lithuania or over Estonia, and that is a difficult proposition because most people can't find those countries on a map, let alone say, yes, we should threaten nuclear war. But what we have to do is we have to have a clear deterrent. So our signals need to be clear. In the past, when signals are not clear, then you have a problem of being misunderstood. And when we said, for instance, our ambassador who talked to Saddam Hussein prior to Saddam Hussein's attacking Kuwait back in 1990, when we said, well, this is not our sphere of influence. Kuwait is not an American protectorate. It's not a part of any great alliance. That's not our business. Then he thought that meant, wow, I can go in there and no one's going to react. Of course,
right.
The reaction was fierce and the reaction was decisive. So, to try to avoid war is the consummate role of the warrior, to be able to be strong enough and prepared enough so that doesn't happen. But it's more than just the military. In fact, it's much more than the military. Our ability to have a good economy, a robust civilian sector, the ability to continue to America to be a strong nation, this is the most crucial thing. And in addition, it is very important for us to think about our internal discord. We have a strong internal discord going on in the country now, and it would be really powerful and a great way to preserve the peace if, in fact, we worked on a concept of intentional unity. Instead of always trying to find what divides us, why don't we try to find the things that, in fact, unite us? And we should have many things in common that do unite us. And understanding that in a democracy, in a democratic republic, we should be able to get along even with different views. Now, this is hard. I mean, you mention abortion, and you get immediate reaction one way or the other. I strongly believe that we need to have a concept of intentional unity, and we need to think about that. Now, that doesn't mean lockstep obedience to anyone. That just means, again, trying to find a way to bring people together rather than bring people apart. And if we have that, we'll be a stronger nation. And if we look at how we can build a better deterrence in this modern world, which is including some of the things I mentioned about cyber, we're going to have to take some offensive cyber operations. We're going to have to punch back once or twice in order to make it painful on the opponent so that we actually have a deterrent that says, oh, wait a minute, he's not just going to sit back there and take it. I actually could suffer too. So that's deterrence, and that's how deterrence works. And although we'd love to be able to say that it would be great if we could all just get along and everyone would be peaceful and we could sign an accord where everybody would agree,
right.
The history of the world shows that the only way you can truly maintain the peace is to be strong and to have a good concept of deterrence so that the opponent says, nope, it's too expensive for me to try to do something provocative. I'd rather get along with them and figure out a way to get along with them.
And that, sir, that kind of brings me to where we sit today with the trade issues with China. China apparently made some significant changes to the documentation in the last negotiation that we had with them, and basically went back and said, we're not going to do some of the things that we pledged to do. And the United States said, look, until you keep your word on what you've already said you'll do, we're not going to talk anymore. And to me, that's an instance where you have to go all the way to the mat. I mean, it is a negotiation, but the negotiation right now in this economy that we're in the United States benefits us. I mean, we're percolating along at 2 and some change in growth, despite the fact that we're having a trade war with the Chinese. So, to me, you've got to your point, you've got to show a willingness to go all the way.
Exactly so. And what's interesting is that as you said, I teach leadership, and I go all over the country talking to corporations and companies and groups about how they can be more effective in leading and how they can be more effective in decision making. And what you see unfolding on the international stage with the Chinese trade negotiations is a case study in leadership and a case study in decision making and in negotiating. So it's very interesting for the Chinese to have come up with a deal that they were almost ready to sign and then last minute pull out of it. If that was their negotiating technique, they really missed the boat. So that's an interesting thing to study. And that's what I like to do is I like to take historical and actual situations that are happening today and learn from them. Because all of us can rise to the level of our leadership. And if we raise that leadership bar, everything in our life can become better. Because if your life is miserable and you can't get along with people and no one seems to want to work with you, it's probably because your leadership level is very low.
It's probably you.
Right. Exactly right.
Well, sir, listen, that's going to get us to the end of the day today. It is always a pleasure to talk with you, and I do want to go walk the sands of Normandy with you one of these days when you're back on one of your trips. And listen, those of you that like to make this trip, if it's a bucket list for you, again, go to American-leadership.com. Reach out to Colonel Antal, find out when they're going over there next. It's a cost-effective thing. It's not enormously expensive, but you get the benefit of having professional military leaders as your guides, and it's super powerful. So, sir, stay in touch with us, and again, keep pinging me, and at the instant I can go with you, I will. Well, you know that the B-2 flight stuff dropped while you were on your trip, and managed to race around the globe. I'm understanding Putin and Z both looked at it too, so good for us.
Well, yeah, you had a great thing going. And I'm also taking a group to Korea, 22 through 29 October. And we go to the DMZ and we see all that and we learn from the history of the Korean War and things. It's an amazing trip. So these are the kind of things I do because I just really enjoy teaching leadership and I enjoy being with people who want to learn.
And go check American-leadership.com for those of you that would like to make one of those trips. You'll never forget it. Hey, that wraps us up for today. Thanks to Matt for doing his normal world-class job. I'm Jeff Bolton on 1210 WPHT.
WPHT, WPHT-HD, WOGL HD3 Philadelphia. A radio.com station. Now, live from the Malamut and Associates Law Studios. This is Jeff Bolton.
Hey, it's Jeff with you here on 1210 WPHT, day after D-Day. Of course, that speech you just heard from our president, remarkable and beautiful. And for all of the grief that he is given, man, oh man, oh man, to see get that right. And his speech there was fantastic. And look, we've got, besides D-Day, the Russians at least threatened to ram one of our ships in international waters. Sheer jackassery. Shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody, but nevertheless, there it is. We've got that to get to, and of course, the trade issue with China. So I wanted to get my good friend, Colonel John Antal, to join us on the program because all of these things fall into his bucket of many areas of expertise. His website is American-leadership.com. You got to throw the dash in there. He's written 7 books on leadership. He coaches, he mentors. He in the Army, had a remarkable career in the Army, and served in a tremendous number of positions. And for our conversation today, Sir, you just got back from D-Day recently, and what an incredible trip. Because of some things I have going on that you're aware, I couldn't join you on this trip, but man, I sure wanted to. How was it?
Oh, Jeff, it was fantastic. First, thank you very much for having me on your show today. And yes, I was just in Normandy with a great group of Americans. A lot of them successful businessmen and a vice mayor of a major town in Texas and other folks who wanted to come out and learn leadership from the lessons learned of D-Day, and that's what we do. So we had this wonderful trip. We were there for 7 days, and we walked where they fought. We had a chance to learn from their decisions and learn from their challenges. And everything we do is totally different than any other trip that people go on. We are immersive, interactive, and memorable, so you actually have to participate. So when we went to St. Miraglise, we drove to a place not far away called Lafayette, and there's a bridge there that was crucial in the fighting on D-Day and the days after D-Day. And this bridge became a choke point to stop the Germans from counterattacking, and then became an important area for us to break out from. And every one of the members who were on our trip had to fight that battle, either as red or blue, and learn what it's like to actually plan, prep, and execute a fight. And then they had to argue their case, like a Harvard case study, against each other, against how they were going to attack or defend. It was just really an amazing experience because it puts you in the boots of the paratroopers, puts you in the boots of the people who live there, and gives you just a small idea of what it's like to actually have been there on D-Day. So it was a wonderful trip. And next time you're going to have to join us.
I'm going to, and you were kind enough to invite me, and I fully intend to take you up on that because it is, as I have said, a bucket list for me to go to those beaches. And while you guys were over there, sir, I was reading Ernie Pyle. As you
That's
know,
right.
I'm a big fan of Ernie Pyle, and I was reading a number of his columns, and man, they make me weepy every time I read them. They are just so well done, and make me more than ever want to go.
Most people may
we'll
not know
that
that Ernie Pyle was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who went with the soldiers in World War II and reported from their perspective. So this wasn't the kind of guy like we have now who in Iraq, is in the green zone the whole time and only comes out from the cocktail bar to make a quick report. This guy lived with the soldiers in the trenches.